Why are there dozens of bikers outside? The manager's complexion turned ghostly as the thunder of motorcycles swarmed the parking lot like a wave of noise and chrome. Just a day earlier, a waitress had been let go, for standing up for a homeless veteran. What exactly had she done? And why had this crowd come looking for her? Emma Carter had been pouring coffee and taking orders at Frank's Diner for the past 3 years. It wasn't glamorous, cheap coffee, the same regulars day after day, and the ever-present sizzle of the grill humming in the background like a lullaby. Still, the job brought her stability. It gave her a rhythm, a place where people knew her name, and she knew theirs. That night, a soft drizzle tapped against the windows. The usual rush had come and gone, leaving behind a quiet dining room with only a few scattered customers lingering over cold coffee. Emma was wiping down the counter when she heard the familiar chime of the doorbell. A man stepped inside, moving slowly, almost unsure of himself. His clothes hung loosely on his frame, his military jacket faded and threadbare from years of wear. The boots on his feet were covered in dried mud and looked like they were barely staying together. She recognized him instantly. He was a veteran, older, quiet, the kind of man who came in when he had just enough change for a coffee, and sometimes not even that. He'd sit for hours just to get out of the cold. Tonight, he didn't place an order. He simply settled onto a stool at the far end of the counter and stared at the menu, like maybe, if he looked long enough, it might give him an answer. His fingers tapped the formica countertop in a slow, uncertain rhythm. Emma didn't question him. Instead, she turned, scooped a hearty serving of meatloaf and mashed potatoes onto a plate, and walked it over. She placed it in front of him, steaming and silent. The man looked up, clearly caught off guard. "Miss, I don't have." "It's covered," she said gently, offering a soft, reassuring smile. For a second, he looked like he might protest. But then his shoulders dropped, the fight leaving his body, and he gave her a quiet nod of thanks. Then the silence was cut by a laugh. Sharp. Derisive. "Well, that's just great," a voice sneered from across the diner. "Feeding strays now." Emma's grip tightened around the coffee pot still in her hand. She turned slowly to the voice. A man in a tailored suit lounged back in his booth, a smug smirk on his face as he lazily swirled the last of his drink. The gleam of his watch under the overhead lights couldn't have contrasted more with the tattered sleeves of the man she had just served. Emma didn't respond. She turned back toward the counter. But he kept going. "You do realize what happens when you start handing out freebies, right?" he said, voice louder now, meant for everyone in the room. "Before you know it, the place'll be packed with freeloaders." Emma's jaw tensed. She set the coffee pot down, firmly. "Excuse me," she said, turning fully toward him. He gave a short laugh and waved her off like a gnat. "Look, sweetheart, I get it. You're trying to play the hero. But guys like him, they live off handouts. That's why they end up where they are." The veteran froze, his fork suspended midair. His eyes fell to the plate and his shoulders curled inward, like he was trying to disappear into himself. Emma's heartbeat thundered in her ears. "This man," she said, her voice steady and unwavering, "wore a uniform so you wouldn't have to. He's earned more respect than you'll probably ever understand." The diner went silent. Even the clink of silverware stopped. For once, the man in the suit had no comeback. His smirk faded as his eyes scanned the room, realizing the attention had shifted to him. With a scoff, he turned back to his meal, muttering something under his breath. Emma exhaled slowly and turned her focus back to the veteran. "You okay?" she asked quietly. He gave a nod, but the hunger was gone. Pushing the plate away, he stood slowly, pulling his jacket tightly around himself. Without saying a word, he walked toward the door. The bell chimed softly as it closed behind him, swallowed by the night. Before Emma could fully process the emptiness settling in her chest, a voice, sharp and cold, cut through the silence. "Emma." My office. Now. She turned toward the kitchen doorway, where her manager stood with arms crossed and an unreadable expression. She swallowed hard, wiped her hands on her apron, and headed to the back. She already knew where this conversation was headed. Emma stepped into the office, the door clicking shut behind her with a dull finality. The flickering overhead light cast uneven shadows across the cramped, cluttered room. Frank, owner of the diner and her boss for the past 3 years, sat behind his desk, arms folded, mouth drawn into a tight line. She recognized that look all too well, stern, calculated, like he was mentally running through options. "You want to explain what just happened out there?" he asked, leaning in slightly. Emma didn't sit. She stayed on her feet, steady. "I gave a meal to a veteran," she said simply. "He didn't ask for it, I offered." Frank let out a slow exhale through his nose and rubbed at his forehead, as if dealing with a child who just wouldn't listen. "Emma, this isn't some soup kitchen. We're running a business. And that means paying customers come first. That man served this country," she replied, her voice even and firm. "He was sitting here in our diner, part of this community, just like anyone else. What was I supposed to do? Watch him sit there hungry and do nothing?" Frank tapped his fingers on the desk, his expression unchanged. "I get it. You've got compassion. But you made a scene, Emma. That's not good for business." She laughed under her breath, sharp and humorless. "I made a scene. No, Frank. The guy in the fancy suit humiliated a veteran in front of the entire diner. I just didn't let it slide." He leaned back in his chair and shook his head. "You really think calling out one of our regulars is smart? That helps keep this place running?" Emma crossed her arms, shoulders squared. "I think letting people get away with treating others like garbage is worse." Frank sighed, fingers drumming now on a stack of invoices beside him. "You backed me into a corner. That guy, he comes in all the time, spends real money, tips big. Now he's pissed, and he says he's never coming back." Emma lifted one shoulder in a shrug. "Then maybe this place isn't worse off without him." His jaw clenched. "That's not your decision to make." A heavy silence fell between them, thick with everything neither of them was saying. Then, without a word, Frank opened a desk drawer, pulled out a folded piece of paper, and slid it across the desk toward her. A pink slip. Emma stared at it, stunned. "Frank," her voice came out quieter now, like she couldn't believe she was saying the words. "You're really firing me for this?" He let out a slow breath. "You're a solid employee, Emma. You always have been. But I can't deal with this kind of drama. I have to think about the bigger picture." Her stomach twisted. She'd known this conversation was going to be rough, but she hadn't expected it to end like this. Her eyes dropped to the slip of paper. Then she looked back at him. "So if I had kept quiet," she asked softly, "if I had let that guy talk down to a veteran and walk out hungry, would I still be working here?" Frank didn't say a word. And in that silence, she got all the clarity she needed. Emma reached forward, picked up the slip, and folded it with deliberate care before sliding it into her apron pocket. "I used to believe this place stood for more than just business," she said quietly. "Guess I was wrong." Frank didn't meet her eyes. She turned, hand on the door handle, but before she stepped out, he finally spoke again. "For what it's worth," he said, barely audible, "I am sorry." Emma paused, just for a beat. Then, without looking back, she opened the door and walked out. The diner felt strangely still. Too still. The man in the suit had already gone. A few patrons remained, nursing their drinks and pretending not to watch her, though their eyes followed her from the corners of the room. Emma untied her apron, folded it neatly, and placed it on the counter like she was leaving behind a piece of herself. Then she grabbed her coat from the hook by the entrance, every movement slow, intentional. Luis, the line cook, stepped out from the kitchen, drying his hands on a dish towel, his forehead creased with concern. "Emma, what's going on?" She gave him a small, almost tired smile. "Looks like I'm officially unemployed." He blinked. "You're joking." She shook her head. His expression darkened, jaw tightening. "That's total crap." Emma reached out and gently touched his arm. "It's over, Luis. You don't need to get involved." He looked like he wanted to argue, like the words were right there, ready to be spoken. But instead, he simply gave a tight nod, frustration simmering just beneath the surface. Emma turned toward the door, her heart pounding against her ribs. But before she could push it open, a hand reached out and gently brushed her wrist. It was an older woman sitting at the counter, a familiar face, a regular who always ordered decaf and left her tip in exact change. "You did the right thing, dear," the woman whispered, her voice low and kind. Emma felt a lump rise in her throat. She swallowed hard and gave the woman a quiet, grateful nod. Then, without saying another word, she stepped outside. The night air greeted her with a chill, the rain now reduced to a soft mist that clung to her skin like fog. She paused on the sidewalk, just long enough to let the truth settle in. Tomorrow morning, she had nowhere to be. No shift to clock into. No place she was expected. As she began the walk toward her apartment, her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out and frowned. The screen lit up with a number she didn't recognize. A single message flashed. "I heard what happened. Be at the diner tomorrow morning. 9 a.m. No name. No explanation." Emma stared at the text, confused. Then, on instinct, she typed out a reply, "Who is this?" No answer. As she walked down the dim, empty street, neon lights from the diner flickering behind her, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had just started, wasn't over yet. That night, sleep barely came. Every time Emma closed her eyes, the conversation with Frank replayed in her head like a scene on loop, the way his voice had gone cold, the mechanical way he'd slid that pink slip across the desk like it was just another line on a to-do list. She had always known the diner was a business first. But she'd hoped it was something more. Something that valued people, not just profits. She had been wrong. The text message haunted her, its vague promise repeating itself in her mind. Be at the diner. Tomorrow morning. 9 a.m. She checked the number again. No name. No clue who had sent it. Just that one line. By the time the sun started rising, curiosity had won. She showed up at the diner a few minutes before 9. The breakfast crowd was already beginning to trickle in, but something was off. A strange energy filled the air, an undercurrent of tension. People had gathered outside, their gazes all fixed in the same direction, the parking lot. Murmurs passed between them in hushed voices. Emma followed their eyes, and then she heard it. A low, rumbling sound in the distance. Not one engine. Not two. Dozens. Her breath caught in her throat as a pack of motorcycles roared into the lot, their engines growling like a storm rolling in. One by one, the bikes came to a stop. Riders dismounted, men and women dressed in black leather vests, patches stitched across their backs. Many bore military emblems, badges of service, history, brotherhood. Emma stood frozen, rooted to the sidewalk. Who were these people? And why were they here? Then, one man stepped forward. He was tall and solidly built, his salt and pepper beard neatly trimmed, his eyes sharp beneath the brim of a weathered baseball cap. His vest was covered in patches, but one stood out more than the rest, USMC. He stopped just a few feet from her and studied her for a long, heavy moment. You Emma? He asked. His voice was calm. Measured. Hard to read. Emma hesitated, then gave a small nod. The man glanced back at the line of bikers behind him, then returned his gaze to her. You're the one who stood up for our brother. The words hit her like a punch to the chest. Our brother. The veteran. The same man she'd quietly served a plate of food just the night before. Emma's thoughts spun. She had figured he was former military, sure, but she hadn't realized he was part of something much larger. She never imagined he had an entire brotherhood behind him. And now, standing face to face with a wall of leather vests, solemn eyes, and military patches, it hit her. She'd stood up to the wrong guy, but for all the right people. The door behind her creaked open. Frank stepped outside. At first, confusion flashed across his face, but it quickly melted into sheer, unmistakable panic. One of the bikers near the front slipped off his gloves, cracking his knuckles with slow exaggeration. So, he said with a grin that didn't quite reach his eyes, which one of you fired her? Emma felt her stomach twist into a tight knot. Hold on, wait, she began, stepping forward quickly. But the leader, the man who had somehow known her name without ever meeting her, raised a hand. Easy, he said calmly. We're not here to throw punches. Just here to talk. He turned back to Frank, who suddenly looked like he wished he could vanish on the spot. You're the owner of this place? The biker asked, voice as even as ever. Frank nodded stiffly, his throat working hard. Why yeah. I am. Great, the man said, tone cooling just slightly. Then maybe you can explain something. Why is it that one of our brothers comes in for a warm meal, gets humiliated by some pompous jackass in a suit, and the only person who stood up for him, gets thrown out? Frank opened his mouth to respond, but nothing came out. He looked between Emma and the bikers, clearly trying to figure out what the safest move was. A few customers inside the diner had started to gather near the windows, watching it all unfold with wide eyes. Emma stepped forward, voice low and sincere as she addressed the leader directly. I mean it, I appreciate all of this. Really. But I don't want anyone getting hurt because of me. The man let out a quiet chuckle. Hurt? He repeated, raising a brow. Darlin', we don't need fists to send a message. His gaze shifted back to Frank. See, we take care of our own. And that man you let walk out of here cold and hungry? He's family. Frank's face was drained of color. I didn't know he was. That's exactly the issue, the biker cut in, his voice losing any trace of amusement. You didn't know, because you didn't care enough to ask. All you cared about was keeping the register full and the right people happy. Guys like him. You just let them fall through the cracks. Frank's voice faltered. Look. But the man wasn't finished. Now don't get us wrong. We're not here to break anything. We don't want a scene. He glanced over his shoulder at his crew, then turned back with a slow grin. Well, we do want one thing. Frank tensed. Breakfast, the biker said plainly. A whole lot of it. A few of the others chuckled under their breath. Frank blinked, taken off guard. You want to eat here? The man smiled, but there was something behind it, a weight, a warning, that made it clear this wasn't exactly a choice. Sure do, he said. If this place was good enough for our brother, then it's good enough for the rest of us. Frank froze for a second too long, then nodded quickly. Yeah, of course. Please, sit wherever you'd like. We'll get started on that right away. The bikers filed into the diner, filling booths and stools like they belonged there. In minutes, the space that had been half empty felt crowded and charged with quiet purpose. Emma stood motionless, trying to wrap her head around what was happening. Then the leader looked back at her. You got anything lined up? He asked. She let out a breath of laughter, short and dry. Nope. Turns out doing the right thing doesn't come with a benefits package. He gave a single nod. That's funny, he said, because we've got a garage not far from here. And we could really use someone who knows how to keep things running smooth. Interested? Emma blinked in disbelief. Wait, are you actually offering me a job? The biker smirked, and there was warmth in it this time, approval, even. You've already shown us that you take care of the people who actually matter, the biker said, his voice steady. That's all we needed to see. Emma felt her throat tighten. The last 24 hours had stripped so much away, her job, her routine, her sense of belonging. And now, here they were, offering her something she hadn't expected to find again, a chance. She let out a shaky laugh, her head shaking slightly in disbelief. Yeah, she said softly. Yeah, I think I'm in. The man reached out his hand, and she took it without hesitation. Inside the diner, the usual clinking of plates and pouring of coffee carried a different weight. The voices were louder, rougher, full of stories shared between those who had lived through things most people couldn't imagine. Tales of service, of loss, of brotherhood. Of days that shaped them and bonds that never broke. And for the first time in years, Emma felt like she was standing in the right place. Frank stood behind the counter, his hands balled into fists at his sides. He watched in silence as the bikers took their seats, one after another. The same diner he'd run for years, once filled with quiet regulars and idle conversation, suddenly felt like a different world. The energy in the room had changed completely. The customers still seated in their booths were stiff, uneasy. Conversations dropped to murmurs, and glances flicked nervously toward the group in leather vests, each one marked by patches, scars, and something unspoken but powerful. The man in charge, the one with the broad shoulders and the USMC patch sewn proudly on his chest, leaned forward, scanning a menu he clearly wasn't interested in. He didn't need to speak loudly or carry himself with aggression. It was the way the others deferred to him, the quiet command in his posture, that made it clear. This was not a man to brush off. Off to the side, Emma stood quietly, watching the scene play out. She had expected some tension when she came back that morning. A few glares maybe, some awkwardness. But this? A full-on biker battalion rolling up in support. Not even close to what she'd imagined. And based on the pale, tight-lipped look on Frank's face, he hadn't seen it coming either. Frank cleared his throat, trying to summon some semblance of professionalism. What can I get you folks?" he asked, voice cracking ever so slightly. The leader lifted his eyes and locked on Frank's, unblinking. "Like I told you out front," he said coolly, "we'll take breakfast for everyone." He dropped the menu onto the counter without ever opening it. "And make sure it's done right. Wouldn't want to let your paying customers down, would we?" Frank gave a dry swallow. "Why yeah. Right. Of course." He spun around toward the kitchen, barking over his shoulder. "Let's move, people. Fire it up, now." Immediately, the cooks jumped into motion, the kitchen erupting into a flurry of clanging pans and hurried footsteps. Meanwhile, the pressure in the room kept building like steam behind a closed door. Emma felt someone step up beside her and turned to find Luis standing there. He was wiping his hands on his apron, eyes wide as he took in the crowd. "This is insane," he murmured, leaning in. "You know these people?" Emma shook her head slowly. "Not really." Luis blinked. "Well, they definitely know you." She didn't respond, mainly because she didn't know what to say. Just then, one of the bikers seated near the counter looked over. He was younger than the rest, maybe in his late 30s. His eyes were piercing blue, and a long scar trailed from his temple down past his jaw. He studied Emma for a second, then gave a crooked grin. "Didn't think you'd end up starting a war, huh?" Emma let out a small laugh through her nose. "That wasn't exactly part of the plan." The man leaned back, resting one arm along the top of the booth. "Funny how plans go out the window when you do the right thing." She nodded slightly but didn't reply. There wasn't much to add. Across the diner, the leader had been watching the exchange unfold. He didn't interrupt, just listened, eyes thoughtful. Then, he turned back toward Frank. "Let me ask you something," he said casually, drumming his fingers against the countertop. "What kind of business fires someone for feeding a veteran?" Frank stiffened. His eyes darted to Emma for a brief moment, then flicked quickly back to the biker. "Look," he stammered, "this isn't really about." But the man raised his hand and cut him off mid-sentence. "I asked you a question." Frank froze, glancing helplessly around the room, clearly hoping someone, anyone, might step in on his behalf. No one did. Even the regulars, people who had been coming to Frank's for years, sat frozen in their booths, not saying a word. No one spoke up. Everyone seemed to be waiting to see where this would go. I had to make a judgment call," Frank said at last, his voice noticeably smaller. "She confronted a customer. One who pays." The biker's mouth curled slightly, like he was chewing over the phrase. "A paying customer," he echoed, as if tasting how bitter it sounded. He leaned in, resting both forearms on the counter, calm but firm. "You ever serve?" Frank blinked, confused. "What? Did you ever serve?" the biker repeated, this time more pointed. "Military? Police force? Anything like that?" Frank shook his head, eyes dropping for a moment. "No. I figured." The biker's tone stayed level, but there was an edge to it now, sharp and deliberate. "See, that's the disconnect. People like you don't get it. You've never had to watch a man sacrifice everything, his time, his safety, sometimes his very future, just so some smug suit can sit in a warm booth, talking trash with a full belly." He let out a breath, slow and controlled. "And when that same man hits a rough patch, you toss him aside. Just another inconvenience." Frank shifted in place, visibly uncomfortable. "I didn't mean." "I know," the biker cut in, his voice still calm, but unyielding. "That's exactly the issue. You didn't mean to, you just didn't bother to think." A silence settled over the diner, thick and charged. The kind of silence that says everything no one wants to admit. The biker leaned back slowly, expression unreadable. "Like I said, we didn't come here to cause problems. We just wanted to see the place where one of ours was disrespected." He let the word "humiliated" hang in the air, heavy as iron. Then he turned his attention back to Emma, his tone shifting gently. "And to make sure you're taken care of." Emma blinked, caught off guard. "What?" Without a word, the biker stood, pulled a folded business card from his pocket, and placed it on the counter in front of her. "We run a garage outside of town. It's honest work. Decent pay. And more important than that, we look out for our people." He met her eyes, holding her gaze without flinching. "You in?" Emma glanced down at the card, her heart thudding in her chest. Everything felt surreal. A job offer? Just like that? Her thoughts flashed back to Frank's cold dismissal, to the way that businessmen had talked down to the veteran like he wasn't even a person. She remembered how it felt walking out of this diner, not because she'd done something wrong, but because she'd chosen to do what was right. Slowly, she reached out and picked up the card. The biker gave her a knowing grin. "Smart move." Behind the counter, Frank looked like he wanted to object. His jaw twitched, and his lips parted, but nothing came out. He said nothing. What could he say? Emma gave the diner one last sweeping look. This place, where she had spent the better part of 3 years, poured coffee, shared stories, memorized orders by heart, it suddenly felt so much smaller than it used to. Like she had already outgrown it. She slipped the card into her pocket. And without another word, she walked out the door, not just leaving the building, but leaving behind the version of herself who had needed it. She stepped into the morning light not as a waitress, but as someone who had chosen to do the right thing, no matter the cost. Outside, the cool morning air filled her lungs as she took a deep breath, grounding herself. The low rumble of idling motorcycles still echoed across the parking lot, their sound vibrating through the soles of her shoes. She looked down at the business card in her hand, gripping it a little tighter. Her mind was still reeling, trying to piece together the whirlwind of what had just happened. 3 years. 3 years of early mornings, double shifts, memorizing the names and quirks of regulars. Late nights scraping by to cover rent. All of it, gone in a heartbeat. And yet, surprisingly, Emma didn't feel weighed down by loss. There was no heaviness in her chest. No panic. No regret. Instead, what she felt was something unexpected, something almost unfamiliar. Relief. Her gaze drifted toward the group of bikers, leather jackets marked with patches and insignias that told their own stories, boots worn and weathered from countless miles. These weren't just people on motorcycles. They were a family, tied together by something deeper than words. Loyalty. Shared history. A bond forged through trials most people would never understand. The leader, the man who had spoken up for her without even knowing her, stood just a few steps away. Arms crossed. Calm. Watching her with quiet, steady patience. He wasn't trying to convince her. He wasn't pressing her for a decision. He had simply extended a hand. And that offer, simple as it was, had shaken something loose in her. "You're really offering me a job?" she asked, breaking the silence between them. The corner of his mouth tugged into a faint smile. "We don't say things we don't mean. You stood up for one of ours, and that matters. We look after folks who do the right thing." Emma exhaled slowly, turning to glance past him at the row of bikes lined up like a waiting cavalry. Engines cooling. Metal glinting in the morning sun. The man she had fed, someone most people would have looked past, wasn't forgotten here. To them, he wasn't just a veteran. He was family. "Where's your shop?" she asked, slipping the business card into her jacket pocket. 10 miles out, he replied. "Nothing fancy. But we run an honest place, and the pay's better than what you got back in there." He nodded toward the diner with a tilt of his chin. "And out there? You won't have to answer to people who don't value you." Emma turned back for one last look through the front window. Frank stood behind the counter, staring blankly in her direction. He wasn't angry. No, he looked small. Shrunk down. Like a man only now realizing exactly what he'd let go. She thought about all the time she'd poured into this place. The early mornings. The tired feet. The way she'd memorized names and favorite orders, just to make people feel seen. And in all those years, she had never once questioned whether she belonged. Until now. She turned back to the biker. "When do I start?" His grin grew wide, this time with something like admiration. "Whenever you're ready." Then a low voice called out behind her. "Emma." She turned around. It was him, the veteran. He stood a few feet away, hands tucked in his pockets. The same battered jacket clung to him, but something had shifted. His posture was straighter, his eyes clearer. He looked like a man who had just remembered who he was. "You didn't have to do that," he said, his voice rough, but grounded. Emma shook her head gently. "No," she said, "I did." He held her gaze for a long moment, like he was trying to find the right words, but in the end, he settled on the simplest one. "Thank you." She gave a small smile. "Anytime." One of the bikers stepped up beside him, handing over a helmet. The veteran accepted it without hesitation, his grip tightening around the strap. Then, moving like he'd done it 1,000 times before, he swung his leg over one of the waiting bikes and settled into place. Emma stood and watched as the crew got ready to ride. Their movements were synchronized, practiced, like they were more than a group. Like they were one. The leader climbed onto his bike last, tugging on his gloves as he looked back toward her. "You need a ride?" Emma hesitated, eyes drifting back to the diner behind her. She thought of all the long shifts. The hours spent cleaning up messes. The quiet exhaustion that settled into her bones. She thought of the moment Frank had handed her that pink slip, cold and matter-of-fact. And then, she thought about this. What it meant to choose principle over convenience. What it meant to stand up. With a slow, steady breath, Emma stepped forward. The motorcycle's engine vibrated beneath her as she swung her leg over and settled onto the seat. The low rumble buzzed through her bones, grounding her in the moment. Leaving behind everything familiar, the diner, the routine, the version of herself that had stayed quiet, it should have been terrifying. But for the first time in what felt like forever, it wasn't. She wrapped her arms around the biker's waist just as the others kicked their engines to life. Together, they rolled forward, and the diner, the place she'd poured years of her life into, shrunk behind her, fading into the background like a chapter that had already ended. The road stretched wide ahead of her. And Emma leaned into it, toward something new. Toward something better. In today's fast-paced world, it's easy to overlook the people who laid the groundwork we now walk on. Veterans. Seniors. Working-class folks. They often go unnoticed. Their stories buried beneath the noise. Their sacrifices taken for granted. But Emma's story reminds us of something we all need to hear. Doing the right thing won't always be convenient. It won't always be comfortable. But it will always matter. How many times have we passed by someone who needed help, looked the other way because stepping in might have been awkward? Too risky. Too messy. A veteran quietly struggling in a checkout line. An elderly neighbor hoping someone will offer a hand with their yard. A waitress working doubles, too tired to ask for support. In a world where profit often speaks louder than principle, it's tempting to stay quiet. But silence never changes a thing. Emma paid a price for her kindness. She lost her job, her safety net. But what she gained? Community. Dignity. Respect. And proof that one small act of courage can echo far beyond the moment. No, most of us don't have a motorcycle club ready to ride in behind us. But we do have the power to create ripples, with every kind word, every small stand, every time we choose to speak up instead of look away. Because when you stand up for what's right, someone always notices. Have you ever stood up for someone, even when it wasn't the easy choice? Drop your story in the comments. We'd love to hear it. Subscribe to Uncovered Tales, because real heroes don't wear capes. They wear conviction. They wear courage. Turn on notifications, because the next story might just remind you why kindness still matters.